What is God like? What is God like? You know, of all the questions that a person can ask, this right here is by far one of the most significant. What is God like? What are God's characteristics? What's God's personality? What is His attitude toward human beings? What does God think of you? I recently, earlier this last week, I had to fill out one of those online recommendation forms for a person who had applied for a Christian college. And, you know, after they had you mark down all the things like how long you've known the applicant, what relationship and stuff, they had this free response box, which just said, please describe the character of the applicant. And you had, 300 letters to do that with or whatever. Please describe the character of the applicant. So if you were asked that question about God, what would you write? What would you put in that box for describing the character of God? What is God like? Now, believe it or not, this is a relevant question for absolutely everybody, even for people who would say right now that they don't believe in God or aren't sure if they believe in God. And that's because, really, before you can make an assessment about whether or not you believe in God, like, yes, I do believe in God, or no, I don't, before you do that, you actually have to have an image or an idea in your mind of what God is like. You have to have an idea of who this being is that you are either believing in or not believing in. In fact, I know that for Earl, one of the questions he likes to ask someone if he's in a conversation with them and it comes out, they say, oh, I don't believe in God. Well, one of the things he likes to follow up with is, oh, well, could you describe God for me? What is God like? Can you tell me what this God is like, who you don't believe in? And oftentimes, after they've done that, after they've described God for a while, Earl will end up agreeing with them. I don't believe in that God either. And if God was really like that, I would want to reject Him as well. So that's why this question is just so vitally important for absolutely every single person. What is God like? And how can we know? There's a song. It's a poem that was later set to music called "Friday Morning," written by an English poet named Sidney Carter. It was kind of popular back in the 60s, so some of you who are more senior members here, you may have actually heard this song sung at some point. It was very controversial when it came out. You'll hear it in the lyrics. There's some very really on-the-edge stuff that he writes that probably to Christian ears could even sound offensive. But it's a poem written in the first person. And so the speaker in the poem is kind of, the narrator of it. And he is imagined to be one of the thieves who was crucified next to Jesus on the day of Jesus' death. Okay, so here's the poem. It says, "It was on a Friday morning that they took me from the cell, and I saw that they had a carpenter to crucify as well. You can blame it onto Pilate. You can blame it on the Jews. You can blame it on the devil. It's God I accuse. It's God they ought to crucify instead of you and me. I said to the carpenter, hanging on the tree. You can blame it onto Adam. You can blame it onto Eve. You can blame it on the apple, but that I can't believe. It was God that made the devil and the woman and the man, and there wouldn't be an apple if it wasn't in the plan. It's God they ought to crucify instead of you and me. I said to the carpenter, hanging on the tree. Now, Barabbas was a killer, and they let Barabbas go. But you are being crucified for nothing that I know. But your God is up in heaven, and He doesn't do a thing, with 1,000,000 angels watching, and they never move a wing. It's God they ought to crucify instead of you and me. I said to the carpenter, hanging on the tree. To hell with Jehovah, to the carpenter I said. I wish that a carpenter had made the world instead. Goodbye and good luck to you. Our ways will soon divide. Remember me in heaven as the man you hung beside. So can you hear the frustration in that poem? Can you hear the anger? Can you see the speaker's perception of God, what God is like? And if you are hearing this with the ears of a Christian, can you hear the deep irony in what's going on right here? What this poem demonstrates is the real and vital need for what John gives us right here in the passage which is before us this morning. We're looking at 5 verses, John chapter 1, verses 14 through 18. And in these 5 verses, John tells us how we can know what God is like, what He's really like, not based on our feelings, not based on our circumstances or the suffering that we're going through right now, any of that, but knowledge from the source, the testimony, the self-disclosure of God Himself. This passage tells us how we can know what God tells us about what He is like. And I know that many of you here really could probably resonate with some of the emotion and maybe even some of the things that the speaker in that poem just said. I know that many of you have really recently been feeling the frustration of living in a difficult world where things just don't work right. You've had to deal with the agony of unanswered prayers, failing relationships. You've suffered through the pain of a body that's breaking down, or watching someone you love go through the same sort of thing. Maybe many of you have felt like the thief on the cross on your own. You're just hanging there in suffering while God is up in heaven with a million angels who never move a wing. This passage is for you. Right here, what John says. This passage is your invitation to see God in the flesh, and thereby find grace and truth. Come and see Him. That's what John is saying. Come and see your God in the flesh. So we will. We're going to start at verse 1 of chapter 1 for context, and then we're going to jump down to verse 14 where our little portion we're focusing on today begins. So, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So we've been using kind of the comparison of a museum foyer to describe how this introduction, this prologue section of John functions within the book. And we've talked about how a good museum foyer not just previews what's going to come and some of the main themes and things you're going to see in the rest of the museum, but it also it captures your imagination. It sparks your sense of wonder. You're like, holy cow, look at that dinosaur! I can't wait to get into this museum, or whatever the display was. And without a doubt, the greatest wonder, the most jaw-dropping of all the deep mysteries of God that John reveals in this prologue section, the greatest one is what John unveils right here, which is the Word became flesh. Now, this declaration right here would shock the original readers of John, the people he had in mind when he actually wrote this book back in the first century. It'd be like a pull the rug out from under them sort of moment. Because remember, this gospel was originally written in Greek, and one of the unique features of the Greek language is that the word for he and for it are the same word. It's the same pronoun, and you don't know whether or not to translate it as he or it until you look at the context and see how that word is functioning within the sentence. So all the way through verse 13, it's actually possible that a Greek reader would be looking at this and thinking all the time that John is talking about an it when he's talking about the Word. That this word was some sort of force still, or something more impersonal. The logos, as Greeks saw it, meaning this principle or theory. they could still keep it in the back of their mind that, John's not really talking about a person right here. Now, they would be missing John's point, of course, as we've talked about clearly. When John says the word in this gospel, he clearly means Jesus of Nazareth. But up till here, they could keep it, interpreting these first few verses in a way that would kind of fit better with their current framework and the sensibilities of their worldview. That would all be blown apart with this verse right here. There is no more possible room for any sort of misunderstanding right here. No possible way to soften the offense of what John is saying. The Word became flesh. So how would that sound to the ears of a Greek or to a Greek-educated Jew? Well, absurd at the very least, and offensive, most likely. Because Greek thought at this time was highly dualistic. And the whole really Mediterranean world at this time, when I say Greek, the whole Mediterranean world at this time was influenced by Greek thought. So Romans thought in Greek paradigms based on Greek philosophers. So did Jews. So did many other cultures at this time. And much of the Greek thought at this time was highly dualistic, meaning that they thought that matter and physical stuff, like body stuff, was vastly inferior to spiritual stuff, the realm of ideas and immaterial spiritual existence. Really, Plato was kind of the godfather of this whole way of looking at the world, and it still persists to this day, big time. Plato taught that your body didn't really matter, that what mattered was your spirit, what was going on internally. He went so far as to say that your body is like a cage, and that your spirit is this winged, feathered thing that's just trying to escape from this physical prison that you're in. And we also live in a culture in which, just in common thought right now, there is a major disjunction between body and spirit, your true self, your personhood, your consciousness, is maybe how people would say that. Your body is just stuff. We're told it's just matter. It's just cells. The real you is what you feel on the inside. Your spirit, your mental state, what you can't see. That's what really matters. It's kind of, I guess I would describe it as a two-level way of thinking. You've got spirit way up here, and you've got body down here. And kind of what you do with your body or whatever, that doesn't really matter so much as what's going on in your heart, your insides. And if there's apparent conflict between the two of those, between your body and your spirit, well, the spirit, the inside, your consciousness, should always win out because that's where true value lies. That's where your true personhood resides. Well, what John writes right here, and really what we see throughout the Old and the New Testament, it's a direct affront to that way of thinking. What John says here is that the divine Word, the being who was true God, the purest of pure spirits, became flesh, became meat, would even maybe be a better way to translate that, because John is using a visceral term here, not just body, but flesh, meat, hair, bones, bodily functions, everything that goes along with being an embodied human being. This is what the Word became. We often, as Christians, use the word incarnation to describe this reality. And again, carne, meaning meat or flesh. Think carne asada, right? This is meat that we're talking about. The same Latin root, the meatification of God, is what John is unveiling in this verse right here. And what a shocking statement to Greek ears. What a total takedown of that two-level dualistic way of thinking. God created matter, according to the Bible, and He called it good. God created flesh, and He created bodies and all of their functions, and He called them good. And in Jesus Christ, this person, the Word, the eternal Spirit, God of God, light of light, became flesh. Meat, hair, bone, teeth, and 20-something different types of fluids that we have in our body. That is what God became. Behold the Word, John says. Behold your God in the flesh. What a shock to Greek ears. And if that isn't just shocking enough, think how this would sound to the ears of a Jewish person at this time. That word dwelt there would probably be the one that would just ring in their ears after hearing this statement. And that word literally means pitched his tent or tabernacled. The word tabernacled among us, which of course would immediately throw the Jewish mind back to the tent, the tabernacle, the tent of the Exodus. We spent a lot of time on this earlier this summer, so those of you who are here for that are probably making those connections already. But as you remember, the tabernacle was so significant to the Jews because the tabernacle was God's home. It was the dwelling place of His glory. And now John is saying that God tabernacled among us in flesh. The tabernacle was so holy that only certain people could enter it at certain times, and after doing like really extensive purification and cleansing ceremonies. And even then, if these people went into the most holy place of the tabernacle, except at the one designated time of year, if they went in there, they would die. And why is that? It's because that little section of the tent, that most holy place, it was really just a 15 by 15 foot cube designated and marked off by a curtain. That place was God's place. It was God's space. It was a little bit of heaven on earth is a way to think about that. It's like where God's dimension and our dimension overlapped in space and in time. This was the place where God dwelt among us. And right here, John is saying to his Jewish readers that tabernacle is no longer a tent, it's no longer a temple, it's a person in flesh, a living, breathing human organism. He is where heaven and earth meet. He is where God's glory resides. The word tabernacling among us. Just pause for a moment and think of the magnitude of what John is saying here to the ears of a Jew. The Almighty God, this would be the creator of all that is, space, time, and matter. He entered space, time, and matter. It's the author writing himself into the book. The playwright stepping onto the stage. The God who created humans, the God who is so much holier and higher that Jews would not even dare to utter His personal name. They wouldn't say it. They would say different things, so they would even avoid saying the name of God. This God became a human. He became a baby that needed to be burped and changed. I have a little baby in our house. They go through a lot of indignities just over the course of one day. This is what God became. He became a little boy who had to, make friends in his village and had skin knees and stuff. A boy who went through puberty. A boy who had to learn a trade. A boy who grew up to spend almost all of his life, all except for 3 years at the end, swinging a hammer with his blue-collar dad in a no-name backwater town. Behold your God, John is saying to the Jews, in flesh. And then you can think about the sheer physics involved in this. The Psalms tell us, and this was very clear in Jewish thought, that God is so immense, so huge, that there is no portion of the universe that is not filled with His presence. There's no part of creation that we could ever go where God is not. If we ascend to the tallest mountain, He's there. We read. If we go to the bottom of the deepest ocean, He is there. If we go to the furthest planet on the furthest star at the rushing edge of the expanding universe, God is right there. He's holding it all in the palm of His hand. Yet in Jesus, this immense God, in all of His fullness, became the size of a human embryo, smaller than a poppy seed. Behold your God, John is saying to the Jews, in flesh. Now, John realizes this is just absolutely an enormous claim that he's making here. A ridiculous claim to most of his hearers, Jews or Greeks. So, to convince them that, yeah, this is legit, he's going to need to provide some witnesses, some affirmation, some testimony to back up what he's saying, and that's what he does. Verses 14 and 15 again, enter the witnesses. 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him. This would be John the Baptist, and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." So John's actually pointing to two witnesses here, two people that he kind of calls to the stand to give their eyewitness testimony about the Word, that yes, Jesus has indeed, the God of Israel has become flesh among us in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The first witness is John himself, John of Zebedee, second being John the Baptist. You see, John the son of Zebedee, this would be the writer of the book, included in the we of verse 14 there. We have seen his glory. So this is, I think this is John the writer's personal testimony about this. It's actually the first time that we have the first person voice used in this book. We, us, meaning me and the other disciples and the other people who knew Jesus. And it's John's way of saying that this isn't just, a secondhand spiritual biography of a great Jewish rabbi that he's writing here. No, this is eyewitness testimony. That's how he frames the book, as eyewitness testimony. This is John really staking his own personal name and his own personal reputation on the content of this book, just like he does at the end. He says this here at the beginning, but then at the end he stamps it with this. John 21:24. He says, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things," meaning me, "and who has written these things. I wrote them, and we know that his testimony is true." So you can trust me about everything I say in this book, John says. I'm putting my name by it. We knew the Word. We saw him. We beheld his glory. We ate with him. We talked with him. We traveled with him. We saw him get hungry. We saw him get thirsty. We saw him fall asleep in the bow of a fishing boat. We saw him draw in the dirt with his finger, make jokes while he was teaching. All of those things. He was a real person, flesh, just like you, just like me. And then apart from this testimony, there's actually some really interesting internal features of the book that point to the fact that this gospel is eyewitness testimony, a first-hand account. I really hope that we can go through some of these as we make our way through the book, because stuff like the place names that John uses in the gospel, geographical features, people that he cites, customs that he describes, all of those sort of things, even the way that he writes the dialogues and the conversations, they all point to the fact that this is an eyewitness document, that this is not, some second or third hand account. And really, I think we're going to highlight a lot of that when we go through it, so I'm not going to spend much time on it now, but you can be very certain as you read through the Gospel of John that this is something that he saw, something that he touched. The Word became flesh. We have beheld his glory. So the second witness he points to is John the Baptist. John bore witness about him. That would be about Jesus, the Word made flesh, and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." And you'll see, this is the ESV we're using here, and you'll see they mark it off, the translators do, in parentheses there. And that's, I think that's a good decision, because really it comes across more as an aside, that John is just kind of plugging this in here. By the way, this is who John the Baptist was talking about in his famous quote of his. There's going to be a lot more about John the Baptist the next 2 weeks. He really kind of gets the spotlight on those. So we'll kind of keep this short for now, but just notice two things here in John's statement. One, the godness of Jesus is emphasized in that first statement. He was before me, meaning the pre-existence of Jesus, his eternality, the fact that he has no beginning and no end, just like God. But two, you've also got the humanity of Jesus and what I would call the historical particularity of Jesus as well. This was he. This was he, meaning a concrete historical individual, a a person who lived and walked in Palestine, a person that John could point to as he was, strolling past the Jordan River in a pair of sandals and say, hey, this is the one. That guy is the one that I was talking about, who also has pre-existed forever. He is the Messiah. Trust John the Baptist. That's what John of Zebedee is saying. Trust me as well. The Word became flesh. As hard as this is to wrap your mind around, we saw it happen. The implications of this are absolutely major. Verse 16. For from His fullness, would be the fullness of Jesus, we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. What makes Jesus glorious? What makes Jesus glorious? We have seen His glory, John says in verse 14 there. But what does he mean by this? What makes Jesus so glorious? You might have gotten the impression when we read that first verse there, verse 14, that this meant that Jesus had some sort of aura around Him, that He just had this glow around Him all the time, or that His feet didn't quite touch the ground when He was walking, but He kind of floated from place to place. Or maybe you think of like those old stained glass windows or painting, and He just kind of had a halo around Him all the time, and people would know that, oh yes, that's Jesus, He's the Messiah. We know He has this glory that's just around Him all the time. Well, that is not what John is talking about here when he says we have seen His glory. As John makes so clear throughout the rest of this gospel, Jesus was, he was an utterly ordinary guy in pretty much every way in relation to His humanity. He's a guy that probably you were walking past Him on the street, you would just ignore Him. There doesn't look like anything special about Him all. A guy that, even if you were a Samaritan woman, you could question with skepticism if He asked you for a drink of water. Like, why are you asking? Why? No, for John, the glory of Jesus, it is summed up in two words, two qualities, grace and truth. These are what make Jesus glorious. It's His transmission of those qualities, these qualities that just really overflowed from His person and His work all of the time. That's what John means there when he uses the term fullness, the fullness of Jesus' glory, from which now we receive grace and truth. Verse 14 again. These two categories come up twice in our passage. Verse 14, and the Word became, we have seen His glories of the only Son from the Father. What was that glory full of? Full of grace and truth. And then right here in verse 16 and 17, they come up again. For from His fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Grace and truth. What beautiful words, what glorious categories. This is what Jesus brings to humanity. These are what makes John able to say that Jesus is truly glorious. First, the grace. Grace really just means God's favor. Grace means God's kindness, which is just freely and generously given to people without cost, people who do not deserve it. If you had to do something to kind of get God's kindness, well, that wouldn't be grace. That would be something different. If you had to really clean up your act, or even just keep your act clean, or follow certain rules, or keep following certain rules, or do certain rituals, or keep doing certain rituals to somehow merit God's favor, then it wouldn't be grace. Hence the word all right here. This is something that all can enjoy without distinction. Grace is, by definition, a gift. It's a free, generous, no strings attached act of generosity from the living God. Hence the word received. You don't earn this. You just open your hands and receive this. We talked about this a lot last week. Get ready. We're going to talk about this throughout John. Jesus is full of grace, and it overflows throughout the entire book. All people, without distinction, receiving God's favor without cost. This is grace. This is what Jesus brings to humanity in a way that it's never been brought before. Because believe it or not, God has always operated as a God of grace. You see this throughout the Old Testament. That's John's point right there when he says that in Jesus we have received grace upon grace. It's sometimes a misconception that people have that in the Old Testament, God was like a God of law, that he expected people to earn his kindness or earn his favor or earn their salvation. And then Jesus came and then things changed, and then now it's like a free gift thing because the law plan didn't really work out that well, so God kind of switched things up with Jesus, and now it's way better. Well, that is a total caricature and misperception of what is going on. The stuff that God did for Israel through covenants, through promises to Abraham and to Moses and so many others, those were clear covenants and actions of grace. God choosing a people, God calling a people, God redeeming a people, God sticking with a people who really did nothing to deserve it. All of that was grace. That's why there is no but in verse 17. The law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. No, that word is not in the text. John is making a progressive statement here, not a contrast of opposites. He's saying God gave Moses the law, which was an act of grace, anticipatory grace, really, and now he expands upon it and solidifies that grace through the person and work of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who the law was pointing to all along. That's the idea with the word upon there, which is another notoriously difficult to translate word here in the prologue of John. In most cases, that word right there means in place of or instead of. It's like a replacement word. And I really think that's the better translation of it here. The grace that Jesus gives is the grace that the law was pointing to all along. The law of Moses was anticipatory. It was looking forward. Well, Jesus is the reality. The law of Moses was based on promise. Jesus is the fulfillment. And again, this grace that Jesus gives is so much superior to that grace that was in the law of Moses that the law is now obsolete. It's really irrelevant now as a means of God's grace. Jesus has totally superseded it. So this is why Jesus is glorious. God has always acted as a God of grace. He has always saved people by grace through faith in his covenant, through the means of sacrifice, and all of that was pointing to Jesus Christ, the reality, the greatest expression of God's grace, the fulfillment of the Old Testament grace, grace upon grace. That's what Jesus brings to the table. Praise God. And then truth, expressed by John so powerfully in the last verse of our passage, really the last verse of the prologue. This is the last thing that we have in our ears before he then just launches into this 21-chapter tale of the life of Jesus. Verse 18. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. So what is God like? It's that question that we asked at the beginning of the sermon. What is God like? How would you describe him to someone else? What is his personality? What is God's character? And how do you know? In this verse, kind of his trademark clarity and brevity and wonder, John tells us the answer. God is like Jesus. That's what God is like. No one has ever seen God. No one. It's kind of where John starts with the distance between us and God, the unknowability of God. Even Moses and Abraham and Isaiah and Ezekiel, these spiritual giants who spoke with God and God spoke to them, even these guys in the Old Testament, they had their visions of God qualified in really significant ways when we read about these stories in the Old Testament. Like they saw parts of God, his back, like Moses did when God passed by him in his glory, or a floating fire pot, like Abraham saw, or the crazy UFO vision that Ezekiel got at the beginning of that book. And that's because nobody can really see God in his raw and unfiltered essence and live. We're human beings. We are just not equipped to handle that kind of holiness. We can't take it. Yet in the very next breath, after reminding his readers of this enormous chasm that exists between them and God, John drops this on them. The only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. Notice the very careful Trinitarian language that John is using right here. There's one God, the only God, as he puts it here. Yet clearly, according to John, this one God exists in multiple persons. He says this all in one breath in this sentence. He's talking about Jesus when he uses the phrase only God there. Again, an explicit declaration that Jesus is indeed truly God, but Jesus is not the Father. He's at the Father's side. So you have an only God who is at the Father's side. Two persons, both distinct, both clearly identified as God. You see this same sort of distinction right there in verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son, capital S, one person, from the Father, capital F, another person. So you got the Father who is God. You also have the Son at the Father's side who came from the Father, so clear distinction, but who is also God. And then from what we know later on in John, you've got to throw the Spirit in there as well, a third person who is clearly identified as God. Each one eternally distinct, yet each clearly presented by God as an eternal unit. One true God. And I get it, if you find this hard to wrap your mind around, that's kind of the point of all of this. John is once again here highlighting the fact that the one true God is an utterly different species than we are. He exists on a different plane with more richness and depth in his very being than we can even begin to comprehend. And yet, in Jesus, this God who is as far above us as we are from a flea, maybe multiply that by 10,000, you get an idea of that chasm that exists between our existence and God's existence. This mysterious, tri-personal, ultra-holy being has made himself knowable. That is the wonder and the glory and the thrill of what John declares in that last powerful statement. He, Jesus, has made God known. This is emphatic in the Greek text. John adds a pronoun there that he doesn't have to really underline the wonder of this, that he himself has made God known. He makes God known through himself. Jesus himself, he's the explanation of God. That's another way that you could put that. It's kind of the nuance that verb, made him known carries. It's actually the same root word there in Greek that we get our English word exegesis from. The explanation, or Jesus exegetes God is a way that you could translate that. This verb is also often used in the context of storytelling or telling a narrative. So Jesus is the narration of God. Jesus tells us God's story through his person. He's the Word, as John said at the beginning. The Word would be something you say, something you want to communicate to another party. Jesus is the self-disclosure of God, the ultimate self-disclosure. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. That's what John is saying here. That's how Jesus brings us truth. He himself is the truth, capital T. He is the light. We look at him, we're looking at God. What is God like, we wonder? John's invitation is to look at Jesus and see. Behold your God, not just as a spinning wheel of fire in the sky or a towering figure that sits on a throne and his robe, fills the temple. Behold your God in flesh, incarnate. Behold your God as he travels around Palestine, teaching people, interacting with very normal, everyday people. Behold your God as he sits by a well on a dusty afternoon and asks a Samaritan woman for a drink. Behold your God as he stops to talk to a disabled person, a guy who cannot walk, can't move, can't do anything to help himself, and then he stops and asks this guy how he can help him. Behold your God as he sits at a wedding. It's a very normal human celebration throughout all time. He's sitting there at the wedding, and behold your God as he navigates a potentially awkward social situation with grace. Behold your God as he commits vandalism, walking into the temple and tipping over tables and making his belt into a whip. Behold your God as he goes to a funeral and stands at the grave of a friend, weeping. Behold the tears of God. What is God like? He's like Jesus. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That's what Jesus tells Philip later on in the gospel. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Don't ask me to show you the Father. Don't ask what the Father's like. You're looking at him. You're looking at what the Father is like reflected in the Son. And he tells all of us that same invitation too. Look at me to know what God is like. No matter your circumstances, no matter what your heart may tell you or other people may tell you about what God is like, there is no God in heaven who is unlike Jesus. There's not. There's no God that does not have the same heart, character, personality, everything that we see reflected in Jesus of Nazareth. He has made him known. Come and see. We have seen his glory, John says, and we want you to see it too. And for John, the pinnacle of God's glory expressed in all of its fullness, all of its beauty, is not seen until we get to the cross. That's really John's answer, without a doubt, to that question, what makes Jesus glorious? It's the cross. And really, it's part of the irony of John's gospel. Because you would think maybe, okay, he says he comes full of glory, we have seen his glory. Well, you'd think, okay, John's probably talking about the miracles that he saw Jesus do. 7 of them, big signs that he describes in this gospel. That's what he's got to be talking about. Or maybe he's talking about the teaching he gives, this wonderful, clear view of what life in this world is supposed to be like for us. No, none of that stuff. And interestingly, you might even think, okay, John's probably talking about the story of the Transfiguration. That's where he saw Jesus' glory, where Jesus was standing on the mountaintop with 3 of his closest disciples, and all of a sudden his clothes turn white, his skin, everything, he's shining like lightning. That's got to be what's in John's mind when he says, I saw Jesus' glory. Jesus is glorious. No, it's crazy. This is the one gospel that doesn't even include the story of the Transfiguration. John leaves it out. Because in John, the pinnacle of Jesus' glory was none of those things that might first pop into your mind. In John, that event is the cross. For John and for Jesus, obviously, clearly in this story, glorification meant crucifixion. John makes this so clear in the text. In John 12:23, Jesus says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." When did Jesus say that? On the eve of his crucifixion. And then again, later in that same night, right when the door shuts behind Judas on his way out to betray Jesus, the very next word Jesus says is this: "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him." What Jesus is saying is that the crowning moment of his career, the pinnacle of his glory, the fullest expression of God's glory to human beings, is when Jesus hangs naked on a cross, dying between 2 thieves. And really, that is the irony of that poem that I read at the beginning, God's Glory. The speaker in the poem, he clearly doesn't get it. He's blinded by his own pain. He's blinded by the injustice of his circumstances. His eyes are not open to the wonder which is beside him right there, which is God is taking the blame of a million billion sins. God is taking action in the most remarkable way possible. God isn't distant. God isn't apathetic. God isn't passive. God is the carpenter hanging on the tree. This is God's victory. This is God's glory, the cross of Jesus Christ, full of grace and truth. Grace because in the place of unworthy sinners, Jesus is dying for them. And truth because to the eyes of a mocking, unbelieving world, blinded by their own sin and rebellion, Jesus on the cross is the fullest expression of what God is truly like. You want to know what God is like? Look at Jesus on the cross and see. See your God as he is betrayed. See your God as he is beaten. See your God as he bleeds. See your God as he is spit upon, as he is mocked, as he is whipped, as he is clad in a purple robe and paraded in humiliation in front of his own people. See your God as he hangs on a cross, and then ask, what is God like? Does God know what we're dealing with down here? Does God know what it's like to suffer? Does he care? Is he willing to do anything about it? Does God love me? Come and see, John is saying. Come and see your God in the flesh. Will you pray with me, please? Father, the love that you have expressed to us through your Son, Jesus Christ, is staggering. It's beautiful. Thank you for making yourself known. Thank you for going to extraordinary lengths so that we can relate to you. We can know what you're like. We can believe in you. We can trust you, even when our own hearts and our own circumstances and everything else seems to say just the opposite. We know that you have loved us because you have done so concretely, materially, physically in the flesh through the broken body of Jesus Christ. Thank you, Father. We worship you now in light of who you are and what you have done through your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.